This presentation looks at the problems of rapid inflation in an economy. We know that inflation is the percentage increase in the general price level from one period of time to another. And we have to understand why, if this rate of inflation is too high, that it causes problems in the economy. Now, we know that we want low inflation and stable inflation. That's the ideal. So, for example, the inflation target of the United Kingdom is 2% plus or minus 1%. 2% is itself quite a low figure, and which shows that we want low inflation, but we don't want it to go up and down by more than 1% a year from that 2% base level. So this means we also want stable inflation. So low and stable inflation is the ideal. But why is this the ideal? Well, in fact, when we really look at it, the actual rate of inflation, whether it's 3%, 4%, 5%, or 6% a year, that's not so important. What's more important is that it's stable at a certain level. So stability is more important than the actual level of inflation. And to see why, we have to look at the following example. Imagine we have an economy in which inflation is quite high, for example, 10% a year. So prices in general are rising by 10% a year. Now that is ideally not what we want. But as long as incomes were also rising at 10% a year, it wouldn't really be a problem because real incomes would be staying stable. In other words, the money that we earn would be rising as fast as prices were rising. And we could cope with that situation. So even if the inflation rate was high at, say, 10%, if it was stable at 10%, that would be a situation that most economies could deal with. However, the problem really comes when inflation becomes unstable, especially when it rises in an unstable way. So, for example, if inflation is 3% one year, and the next year it rises to 5%, the next year prices start rising at 8%, and then the following year prices are rising at 12%. This is accelerating inflation. And it is clearly not stable. This is a situation which is not stable. This is what causes problems in our economy. And to see why, let's examine the various effects that this accelerating inflation has. The most serious effect of accelerating inflation is that it changes the expectations of consumers and households as to what's going to happen in the future. So if households expected inflation to be 3% and the actual inflation rate was 7%, they were very wrong in their expectations. Now, having been proved wrong in their expectations, households may indeed change their behavior. And the most serious way in which they can change their behavior is to ask for higher wage claims from their employers. And if their employers grant these wage claims, if they allow the wage claims to be passed and pay their workers more, this will increase the cost of production. And as the cost of production goes up, the prices of goods will go up even more, which means that inflation will encourage more inflation. So through a process of unexpected inflation and changed expectations, we get higher wage claims, which increase the cost of production and lead to more inflation. This has a name. It's called a wage price spiral. And if it starts happening in an economy, it can lead to business bankruptcies and recession. So businesses can go bankrupt as a result of prices of their wage costs rising rapidly, which means they run out of cash and they have to stop trading. And if enough businesses go bankrupt, then unemployment will rise, aggregate demand will fall, and the real output of the economy will fall, which is what we call a recession. So a recession can be the result of accelerating inflation, and this is the first and biggest potential danger of unstable inflation. The second problem is that certain groups of households become poorer as a result of unstable inflation. A prime example is pensioners who have retired. These are people who have retired and who are receiving a fixed income from the government. This fixed income rarely rises as fast as inflation if inflation is unstable. And so what happens is that these people, the pensioners, end up becoming relatively poorer over time, and this can cause them great hardship. The third problem is that people who save money, savers, sometimes find that in periods of unstable inflation, interest rates that they earn from putting their money in banks may not actually rise fast enough to keep up with inflation. So we know that inflation reduces the wealth of households. So if you save, if you have saved in the bank £1 million, for example, inflation will reduce the value of that £1 million. Now, the only way that that value can be maintained is if interest rates rise as fast as inflation. So if you have £1 million in the bank and the bank is paying you more interest, this can actually compensate for the fact that prices are rising, so that your wealth remains intact. But unfortunately, sometimes the interest rates don't rise as fast as inflation, and wealth does not remain intact. And this is a problem for savers. It discourages people from saving. The fourth problem is that firms may actually reduce their investment spending during periods of high inflation because all costs become difficult to predict, and they don't want to plan to invest money in building, say, new factories or buying new machines, and then find that the machines or the factories are going to cost 3 times as much as they planned or budgeted for. And this can easily happen when inflation is unpredictable. So another bad effect of inflation is that it discourages investment in the economy, which is of course important in the long run because investment is what increases the productive capacity of the economy. A fifth problem is that rapid inflation makes exports from a country uncompetitive, and this can happen despite the fact that the currency may depreciate as a result of the rapid inflation. So despite the currency depreciation, we may find that exports fall. And because exports are an injection into the circular flow, a fall in exports represents a fall in real GDP. So this is a fifth problem of rapid inflation. So we've seen that rapid and unpredictable inflation is very damaging to the economy, but we have to bear in mind that inflation which is too slow can also cause problems. For example, it can indicate that aggregate demand is rising too slowly, that there is a slow increase in aggregate demand, which is not healthy for the economy. And inflation which is slow can become negative. In other words, prices can start going down. So if prices start to rise too slowly, this may be a warning that prices could start actually falling, which is called deflation. And this is very dangerous for the economy, as we will see in a later presentation. So although rapid and unpredictable inflation is damaging to the economy, it damages many sectors of the economy. Low inflation is also dangerous, and therefore we have to try to maintain inflation at some kind of relatively low and stable rate, which is difficult at times, but that is why we have an inflation target in the UK of 2% plus or minus 1%.